Okay, I will start with thanks, first of all. Thanks to Assad, to Barbara, Sebastian, all the team here for hosting this event. Also for being, over many years, very good friends and hosts for a number of activities. There's a long tradition of events relating to typographic design, history, exhibition, research, centered in this institution, bringing also a new generation of practitioners into the world of research, for which I am very grateful, and I can only repeat my very warm feelings for being here. Also thanks to the ATypI team, both people who are here and in other parts of the world, for helping put the event together, publicize the event, and organize it. Again, these things are not solitary. The idea of a working seminar is something that has a long tradition. It is something of a little obsession of mine. The working seminars at ATypI started in the 70s, stretched into the middle of the 80s, for a number of events, always hosted in some institution that had some connection with education, not just the practice of typographic design, and always with the intention of creating a network that would have some impact. In many cases, there was some concrete output, some texts, and so on, that we could say had results much higher than the scale of the event would allow. And we've taken this recipe forward into this series of events. This is the first of the new series that is in Europe. There's been one in Colombo and one in Mexico. More are planned for later in the year. And the idea of having a small enough event where people can exchange ideas is central to this recipe. I'm also positioning myself in the time because I'm showing an emigre who worked in France, speaking in England, holding a German typeface. And this is a lament for me for the kind of world I grew up in. And I am now a witness from the bylines as things are changing. And this kind of thing maybe is becoming a little bit more difficult. But ATypI, from its very early beginnings, had research and discussion research at its heart. The very first documents talk about collaboration with journals. What was then the Journal of Typographic Research, founded in 1967, now Visible Language, was central to these discussions. And there was even a proposal for running a translated version of the JTR into French, sponsored by ATypI. That didn't happen for obvious reasons. The logistics of it would be very difficult. But the idea that ATypI would collaborate with research and publications from the very beginning is quite important. So I need to position myself a little bit. I do not have a PhD. I abandoned mine, which on one level qualifies me to speak well about this, because PhDs are one of the most traumatic and stress-inducing experiences for a lot of people who go through this process. And there is actually quite a long record of the problems and challenges that people face. That will relate to how PhDs are run, and that is important. I'm also speaking with the benefit and the burden of 25 years of presence at Reading, which wears the fact that it's within a university very strongly. That brings a lot of benefits because it has an institutional framework. It also has a very awkward position of being a design school in a traditional university, which means that for the last 50-something years of its existence, it tries to justify what it is that it's doing. And it is quite interesting that institutions that see themselves as delivering courses in physics and engineering and pharmacy still might not know very well what to do with a practice-based discipline in a research environment. So all of that stuff informs my views. I find PhDs a very interesting subject discussion for how design as a field evolves, and especially within a changing higher education environment. So even what is a PhD is interesting. These are two PhDs I've had the honor of supervising. One is 150 pages. The other was just about able to squeeze into one volume, and it's, I think if you print out, it's an obscene 700-something pages. That's a problem, because in many other environments, you have a pretty good idea of what is a PhD, or what are the visible signs of 3 years of full-time effort. And I think this kind of inconsistency is part of the things that we have to address. So what is interesting about PhD is that it is not exactly described by the mode of the experience of the student. And it's unique in PhDs. In pretty much everything else that is part of someone's education experience, there's a program specification, there's learning outcomes, what you have to do, there's a very clear description of how you achieve these things. The experience of the student is well defined, down to the level of the contact hours you will have with different kinds of experiences. In most cases, this might not reflect reality exactly, but the contract the student conducts with the institution includes these things. PhDs, that doesn't apply. You have very clear ideas about the form of the outcome, but not the route that leads you there. I'm going to use this as a basis, the kind of criteria that we use in my institution, but they are fairly clear. So the idea that there is new knowledge created, there is original research, or some kind of advanced scholarship, a critical engagement with your subject, that merits publication. That is quite interesting, because it means that there is knowledge that has to be produced in a certain format at the end. It has to be done in a systematic way. That is quite important, and it's very relevant for people who might be doing research on their own as independent professionals or researchers, that you have a framework within which this research happens, that it is documented, that it is explaining itself to a peer community, and it can be examined, it can be interrogated. Then that person who does research does this as much as possible independently. Again, this is something that is different from other modes of study, that this person has to demonstrate that they themselves are developing the skills that allow them to do this thing with support, rather than executing the actions that some program of study starts. Then, that there are certain techniques. That is a particularly difficult problem for us, because depending on the kind of PhD we might be doing, the techniques might be very well established or not. If you're doing a PhD in pharmacy, that's a fairly clear model. You have specific techniques in a lab-based environment that you have to follow, and you're done. If you're doing a PhD in typography, you might be doing archival research, or you might be doing living history, or you might be doing research with subjects that you run experiments on, and so on. So there's a range of techniques for which there might be not very clear ideas about the balance of them. And that they have to be clearly articulated. They have to be explained in a way that your peers can understand their contribution to your research and your thinking. So there's a lot of stuff there that is critical. And I return back to this point, which is the fact that we have to decide what the final object is and what the skills that the researcher develops are, rather than the route that they take. That essentially means that in many cases, the PhD candidate becomes a test experiment in themselves for how they develop a certain set of skills, how they develop original techniques for learning, and how do they find the right format for these things, the right scale of this. And I say this with a sense of shame, because the room includes a lot of people who bear the mental health scars of me learning on their backs for how they should do this thing. So the burden of the institution or the supervision in this kind of process is much heightened in relation to pretty much any other learning experience. So there's this issue of what kind of PhDs do you do, and a lot of the stuff that we're more familiar with have to do with explanation and interpretation, and there's a lot of longer history of output in this respect, including PhDs by people done in this room. You could call this the looking at things and try to explain why things happened the way they did by whoever did them and with what motivations. And we can talk about history-based research or methodologies from history, sociology, and so on that feed into this. There's a lot of relevant publications, we might think of Eisenstein or Febvre and Martin, which feed into this kind of narrative, but they themselves do not see themselves as typographic research. They might think of themselves as printing historians, or historians of the book, or historians of texts, or historians of trade, but we share in the same area, the findings. Indeed, work that is done by people like Ricardo, who's sitting there, Sebastian in the back, draws on techniques by people in related disciplines in the humanities and produces something that we would call a typographic PhD, but will sit very comfortably in an environment that has a very well-established academic framework. And that is a bit of an issue, because you have to explain how these methodologies can transfer into a different environment. A lot of the analysis that has happened, this is from a PhD for Sinhala, where things are documented. Again, who did what and when, and with some interpretation of the why might be part of this. But you might have, this is a picture from Ricardo's PhD, you might have interrogations of methodologies of interpretation. How do people create meaning? And this is the more interesting thing, that the documentation of why something happens is not particularly interesting beyond a certain point, but once it gives you a tool set for then asking questions of what are the motivations, what are the agents, how does meaning get created through typography and through the discussion of typography, that is something a bit more interesting. A lot of techniques from linguistics. Borna is smiling because he knows my views on this research. I think the kind of research we do also tells us things about how we see our discipline. So there's a lot of work in this, especially done in the 70s, which was evidence of typography trying to be a serious discipline. And in order to do it, it absorbed techniques and subjects from already established disciplines, and also appropriated that kind of language. So there's echoes of this still to these days. So I would say a lot of research tells us more about what people think is important for them to be doing at the time, rather than necessarily meaningful for the discipline. I'm willing to be corrected in this. The most interesting area of discussion is the relationship of practice and research. And this is something that a lot of institutions shy away from, especially, I should say, the more well-established or serious institutions, because they might have built a reputation on research like the other things that I showed earlier, the more text-intensive or collections-intensive research. But we are in a practice-based discipline, and there is quite a lot of stuff that people do that is called research that is part of typography. So therefore, to avoid this discussion of how does research fit into practice is a bit of a problem. There is also a challenge of having a more nuanced discussion than what might be an engineering approach. So a lot of research-based practice might treat typography as a solution exercise. You have a specific set of circumstances that are your starting points, and then you document the solutions and the questions you've asked in order to solve a specific problem, which is a simple way of looking at it. But there might be another way of looking at practice and how it can inform research, or how to integrate practice and research, that I think is more interesting and more rich in how we work. So there's a question about how collaboration comes into research and how we talk about it, which is not clear yet. So there's a number of challenges coming ahead. One of the most important is, how do you position PhDs in existing higher education institutional frameworks? Again, this problem of where do PhDs happen, or are they allowed even to happen? So if you're in an established university, then there might be a route where you can have a PhD. If you're in a school of design, then your bachelor's or your MFA might be considered a terminal degree for that path, and then you might not have an institutional framework that allows you to do this. That's a problem in many countries. In some cases, it has led in the founding of new design schools or the opening of design schools within universities. It might have led to collaborations, depending on the national framework, so that there might be perhaps a parallel route. You go and do your first degree in a design school, and then you sort of step sideways into something that has an institutional hat that says we can do PhDs, and you do that. That is, I think, an expediency. You do it because in the short term it might help you do it. I think in the long run it needs something different. But it means that you need to have these discussions with people who are not designers, not typographers, and they don't have any particular interest in understanding the discipline because it's not their job. They might be education administrators in a ministry. They might be people in a large institution whose job it is to ensure the viability of whatever programs you're proposing. So they're looking at very different perspectives into this. But that is absolutely critical. Then there are environments that are changing beyond what we see mostly in design schools. That has a lot to do with the internationalization of design studies. So what we'll see is that Europe, and especially the Americas, have a very long tradition of design schools doing design studies, but beyond, there's an emerging tradition of universities doing design studies. So we'll see institutions in Asia especially that are proper universities and they have large design schools, and the institutional framework for them progressing from a bachelor's to a PhD is actually much easier. So if you look at China right now, which is a very interesting case of where things are going in large numbers, there is a huge number of PhDs in design. They might not necessarily look like what we might expect a PhD to look like, because the mode of learning might be different, but you have a piece of paper that somebody has that says you've got a PhD in design from a very well-respected university. And if you've got a country like China doing it, churning these things out at significant scale, then you can't be a small European country saying, oh, we're not going to allow PhDs to happen, because that distorts actually the market for education. So I think the whole framework for enabling PhDs in, let's say, slightly older structures in Europe especially, needs to open up to the speed at which PhDs are now being conducted, especially in Asia. This is changing also within Europe. It's changing gradually also in the States in an interesting way through the route for tenure. 10 years ago, you would apply for tenure in a design track in an American institution, and you would be expected to produce lists of clients you had worked for. The bigger the clients, the better. Maybe you had done a few exhibitions and so on, and you'd done a lot of teaching and that stuff. More recently, the tenure track route includes outputs that pretend to be academic outputs. And I say pretend because each institution has its own idea of what academic outputs are. They might be articles in iMagazine or on the AIGA website, which might not be seen as serious research in another environment, but they are pieces of writing. And they might involve some reflections about the discipline and so on. So it means that somebody who is now aiming to get tenure in an American institution needs to produce texts. And gradually this will be formalized and it will change the idea of what these texts are. Then there's the wider issue of the higher education environments, mostly with relation to funding, which especially after 2008 has changed in a negative way for design, for the obvious reason that after the crisis, government said science and technology is going to save the world, and all the funding for the humanities just got cut. So we saw a deep cut in the support for postgraduate education in design, simply because the pot of money that was available was smaller. But this had a knock-on effect that it made it actually quite difficult for a lot of people to get support through those PhDs. The other environment that is really important is the trend towards a more organized and centralized evaluation and quality assurance of education. This is happening everywhere. It is connected to some degree to institutions following the Bologna process model for, let's say, parity across degrees, but actually it has quite a lot of knock-on effects from the managerialization of education. Simplistically speaking, you can imagine of an educational experience as a spreadsheet with hours and effort by students and contact hours by some member of staff that gives them an experience that is controlled and mapped onto specific learning outcomes and so on. And this is happening in a very pervasive manner. So then you can exactly cost how much somebody's education experience is taking. Ratna is nodding because you have to fight that stuff every day. But it doesn't happen in PhDs. So PhDs are sort of the odd family member out there, exactly because the mode of study doesn't exist there. I don't know to what degree that can happen exactly because of the nature of PhDs, but it is an environment where the value of the education experience is increasingly controlled by a managerial approach rather than an educational outcomes approach. Institutions in the UK are in the grip of this right now because we're in the final steps of a cycle of a six-yearly research evaluation, which will determine funding, which will determine the possibilities to do things and so on. And you can probably find many more articles arguing against the value of this process and the investment in it rather than its merits. So one thing that is really changing is that the idea of what a terminal degree is changing. Again, a terminal degree would mean you get your MFA and then that's it, you're done for your career. You don't need to get something else and you're qualified to teach. That is very rapidly being changed, and now MFAs in many institutions are not considered enough for people to teach at postgrad level. They're expected to have a proper research-based master's, which means academic outputs, or higher, and either be registered for a PhD or have a PhD in order to get a position that will allow you to teach. That is an interesting problem if you think that all of these younger career, not in age, people who are applying for these jobs might be coming out of career paths that didn't necessarily give them the opportunity to get those PhDs. So then you have this interesting problem of PhDs that have to be done mid-career or part-time or alongside other things. And I see from Portugal, there's like a bunch of you who've done exactly that kind of thing. This happened about 12 years ago with a big review of education and the idea that you should fund the growth of PhDs so you can sort of seed the next generation of teachers. But all of these people are mid-career. They're part-time students. You need to figure out what is the nature of a part-time PhD. So this has happened in a rather rapid way and without necessarily anybody thinking, well, what is a part-time PhD for somebody doing it mid-career in a practice-based discipline? And what do you do once you've got them? What are the schools into which these people graduate to work in, and what are the career paths of the next generation? So there's a lot of stuff that is not necessarily done with a long strategy in mind. Then developing more ways of supporting people. If I'm a bit crude, unless you get good funding for a PhD, it really is not worth doing. It's a huge amount of time and effort invested that you will never recoup unless you have the tree that money grows on. But there has to be some value in it, and it either has to be something that reflects directly to credible career prospects, which are not there at the moment for the people that we want to be doing PhDs, or there are imaginative ways of supporting PhDs. Again, it's interesting to look around the world where people do PhDs while working as teaching assistants, but with proper contracts and proper support, so they know that it will take them perhaps 4 or 5 years to do something, but they will have to put in certain hours at a reasonable salary in order to fund their PhD. A lot of disciplines in the United States do this. A lot of institutions in Asia do this, where people function as teaching assistants while they're doing their PhDs. Europe is a bit behind on this, and that is to our deficit. And the other problem that we really need to be working on is this problem of which disciplines do we draw techniques from, do we draw scholarship from, and how do we produce texts or outputs that, again, feed back into this dialogue. Typography, by its nature, draws on many different disciplines, so then it has a problem of definition of itself. And a lot of the PhDs are probably the best, PhDs are the best route for us to clarify this, to find these limits of what are the skills that people need, or what is, I know enough about the history of printing or enough about the technology of this or that in order to write confidently and competently about something. We seem to be doing this on a case-by-case basis rather as an institutional or a sectoral basis. So what is, I know enough about anything in order to have the skills to do a PhD in this. And all of that stuff needs to be built into some institutional strategy. Again, the funding cycles of institutions come into this because that's a challenge. So if you have a funding cycle that is operating on, say, on a 2-3 year basis, that means PhDs are out of the cycle. It takes you 3 to 4 years to get one generation of PhDs through. It means that you need a strategy of about 5 years at least. So if you want to develop a PhD program, you need a 5-year investment to get a program set up and running, enroll a bunch of people, get them through in the first cohort, and that will allow you to feed something in. But a discussion about a strategy of at least 5 years, or actually maybe 8, 10 years, is a difficult one to have with higher education now, because the leaders of the institutions themselves don't expect to be in place and for that length of time. So there is an issue there where you might have a problem, a discontinuity between the funding environment, so the strategy of institutions, and what is needed for developing this. The other thing is that we are still unclear of how do we prepare people for this. What are the specific forms of research outcomes? Again, I showed you 2 very different PhDs earlier, and there's a very big range. What is a sufficient representation of 3 years' worth of full-time study? Even if you have a good idea of this in one institution that might have experience, there isn't necessarily a good sharing of this across many institutions. So somebody in an institution that is now trying to develop their PhD program might actually have a really big problem with this, because they have a student that needs guidance of how much effort is enough or how much effort is too much, and what is just enough for a PhD, which is really the critical point, and what is your PhD plus 3 more articles that you should have written later. And who supervises that stuff? That is, again, a critical problem. How do you supervise PhDs that are interdisciplinary by their nature, that draw on different techniques? What is the balance of supervision input for people that might have different learning profiles? And again, the interesting experience from the point of view of the supervisor is that a PhD might mean very different challenges for different people. It might be developing skills in writing, or skills in critical thinking, or skills in documentation, or skills in conceptualization. And these things are not necessarily transferable across different projects. So you often don't know exactly what the challenge will be when the PhD starts, but you need to be able to explain to potential applicants, these are the ranges of skills that you might need to develop, this is the kind of support we can offer for this. And I don't think we do this very well now. We're mostly using reputational values to get this thing across. Then, the elephant in the room, and I think the most interesting area of development, is the role of practice and research. There's all sorts of issues that have to do with different formulations: research-based practice, practice-based research, research-informed practice, practice that is all sorts of things. And I think the mess in the terminology shows that people are not necessarily very clear about what is the relationship with research and practice. We know that people are doing research in order to do practice that is innovative in some respect, and they might even be writing about it, but we haven't explained what form this should take and what is a sufficient criticality in order to say this is a PhD. Do I have? Yeah. Mutu is sitting somewhere in the audience there. This is not a PhD, it's an MRes, but it is relevant because it allows to develop some ideas. So this is a research project that involves a new digital typeface for, let's say, a script that is not in use by a living community. It's used by academics and researchers in it. So there's a historical element to this, which is research that we can understand well, because you have to look at stuff and figure out what's going on there. But then there might be elements of developing new digital resources, asking questions about how new technologies of rendering or new modes of making documents place limitations on the script. So you could say this is a research question that is valid because it has not been answered before. How do you formulate that script in a valid and acceptable form that works in these kind of environments? And then what you do with it. Once you've done this, how do you write about this so that people can understand what the critical elements are, what are the key questions that you've raised, how can you create this conceptual framework that then others can take and apply onto others? And I think that is quite key in this, to see how you make the connections between specific approaches and others. The other thing that we're still not clear about is publication routes. That is something that anybody that has to do with explaining the value of their work through citations and so on will have come across. Because if you're working in physics, then everything gets automatically checked and your ORCID profile will tell you who cited your publications and you're done. In design, what is a referable, sort of a referenceable publication? Again, is the article that is published online. Ricardo's articles on Medium, they're just stuff on an online platform, and yet the scholarship that goes in them might be of the level that you expect for a serious academic publication, but there's no way to connect the views of these things to other publications and so on. So there's deficits there. There's also the huge problem of copyright. A lot of the work that's being done drawing on collections is limited very heavily in how we can translate this into open access publications, exactly because of rights of images. So the environment that we're under right now for a lot of the research places a lot of restrictions in extremely high quality research and it not being able to be transmitted more openly. And that is a serious problem for many researchers. Again, you have the sense of you've got someone who spent 3-4 years of their life doing something that is really significant and original, and then you're telling them you can't publish this thing. or it will be published with lots of gray boxes because you can't get the rights for something like this. Nobody's going to make a lot of money from this, but it means that an environment that was developed for a commercial exploitation of image rights is now limiting the spread of knowledge and the network effects of this provides. Titus has the joy of seeing his PhD turned into a book, which I think nobody can afford to buy for themselves because it's a 3-digit figure, and it's only for libraries and institutions to buy. And you're thinking, that can't be right necessarily, because the people who most have to benefit from a text like this are not the ones that can afford to spend 100 and whatever pounds for a hard copy. So I think that is an issue. So there's a number of issues that we have to deal with, and I think picking up on the relationship of practice and research and using it as a test case to develop all of these ideas about what does it mean to do a PhD, how do you evaluate it, how do you supervise it, how do you provide an environment for it, is the most ripe environment at the moment. Not least because, especially in Europe, there are all these schools which are transitioning into doing PhDs in collaborative setups with other institutions where there is a very long and well understood environment for practice, and to ignore it would be short-sighted, to say the least. So you can't say, I'll take a design school that for decades has been producing very well-informed design practitioners and pretend I'm going to now be an old-style institution with a big library that just does heavy text-based PhDs. That sort of misses the point. Maybe you can say, what's the strength of that institution? Look at the range of practice and then try to see how you can use that as a starting point for doing something that looks like a PhD that's acceptable. I have 2 footnotes to this, and that's because I have the good fortune and the frustration of reviewing a huge number of papers and presentations by people who applied to conferences and publications. And for me, they're a sign of the immaturity of the process. One is the lack of clear language, that we still see a lot of environments where especially early career researchers indulge in overcomplicated language to make their work appear more serious. So there's almost a fear or a guilt of using clear, simple language because it will not sound academic. There's an irony in making this statement in France, of course, because the French bear some responsibility for this. Yeah? But this is a serious problem if you're seeing someone who is working towards their PhD and they're putting together conference proposals, and it's clear that they're trying to use words with 7 syllables instead of words with 2 syllables. And that shows that also the environment in which they're working in is pushing them in that direction rather than actually helping them. The second is the issue of visual documentation, where a lot of institutions push people to write things that don't have pictures. To me, this seems really odd because we are in a visual discipline. We're in a discipline where we make stuff, and to produce any piece of research that doesn't make reference to the things that we're making is at least odd. And especially if you're talking about materials, then not to have a very good integration visually of the materials into the text, again, seems like a negation of a core element of our discipline. Again, a sign of insecurity if you see a PhD thesis that is TypeScript pages endlessly, and maybe there's a few pictures at the end. I think that is telling you more about the institutions rather than the quality of the research. Finally, the more interesting area that's been developing in recent years that has to do with knowledge transfer. This is research hiding under the language that industry understands. So it is a route for collaborative projects with companies, with the professional sector, which might bring some of the research attitudes or the inquiry that is happening in a university comfortably into a professional world, and then it becomes a route for someone to have also a research output like a PhD. This is growing. There are funding routes for this. It has the benefit of appearing more productive to the funding environments. Mathieu who is somewhere there, might be mentioning this, because a lot of the stuff that's happening at ACAL has an element of this in there, which is a language that a company can understand, but also an educational institution can understand. So it's sort of one foot in either world, which I think there's much more route to grow into than is currently active. So I'm going to finish this with a bit of speculation. And in this, I have to come clean, and it's because I've just done 25 years in the UK, and maybe it's a point of reflection. I'm thinking, what's the next 10, 15 years of my career going to be? But I think this, the next decade is really going to be very active in this area, in seeing what was 20, 25 years ago an exception in design studies, a very small number of institutions doing these higher degrees, being something that is much more prevalent, much more widely understood, that we can talk about research in education environments at a very high level. Clearly, we have an understanding of how this works, and we can also see ourselves as part of a community that communicates at that level and produces outputs throughout the world at this respect. That is something that will help typographic design become better understood as a discipline. It will increase the, let's say, the moat, the chasm, the gorge, depending on your attitudes, it might be between design and art. And I think this is a realization that some people might be more comfortable than others. I'm extremely comfortable with this. But I think what is research in art goes in very different directions from what is research in design, and we need to maybe be more comfortable in design being a discipline that has more distance with art, especially in its research. But actually there is a lot of potential there, and I think institutions that are more strategically inclined can also tap into the recent political changes that have been going on in Europe and open up opportunities. To be more blunt, the UK is killing a market for international students. Somebody needs to step up and offer that. And it might very well be from institutions here. So thank you very much. And I hope I've given us some talking points for the rest of today and tomorrow. Thank you.